We've all heard stories about ancient rulers who were worshipped as gods. They built towering figures of gold and stone. Their names were whispered with a mix of reverence and fear, and they commanded absolute power, not just over armies, but over the cosmic order itself. But here's the real question. Did they actually believe it? Did a pharaoh in Egypt, a king in Mesopotamia, or an emperor in China look in the mirror and see a god staring back? Or was it all just the most effective political propaganda ever invented? This isn't just a question about ego. The answer gets to the heart of how entire civilizations saw themselves, their world, and their place in the universe. It reveals how they understood power, religion, and reality itself, and shows the immense burden placed on the one person who stood between humanity and chaos. We're going to explore three of the world's most foundational ancient cultures: the sacred river valley of Egypt, the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, and the vast lands of China. We'll investigate their claims to divine authority to find out who is considered a literal god walking among mortals, who was merely a divinely appointed messenger, and what that critical distinction tells us about the nature of power then and now. The truth is a spectrum, a sliding scale of divinity that's far more complex and fascinating than you might think. Egypt, the god king. Let's start in the land of pyramids and papyrus, ancient Egypt, because here, our central question gets its clearest and most direct answer. Yes, the pharaoh wasn't just like a god. He was a god. This wasn't a metaphor. For nearly 3,000 years, it was the absolute bedrock of Egyptian society, politics, and religion. From the moment of his coronation, the pharaoh was believed to undergo a complete transformation. He stopped being a mere man and became the living incarnation of a god on earth, specifically the falcon-headed sky god, Horus. The living king was Horus, protector of Egypt. Upon his death, he would mystically become Osiris, the god of the underworld, while the next living king would become the new Horus. This divine cycle guaranteed that kingship itself was eternal. This idea was baked into the very language. In official inscriptions, the king was consistently called NTR-NFR, which translates to the perfect God. He was also called the living image on earth, a direct reflection of gods like the sun god Ra, with whom the pharaoh also became deeply connected. His divine status was the central pillar of their ideology. His main job was to maintain the fundamental concept of cosmic order, truth, and justice. If the Nile flooded on schedule, if harvests were good, and if Egypt was stable, it was because the god king was successfully doing his job. His authority wasn't just political, it was cosmic. And this belief was reinforced everywhere you looked. The sheer scale of the architecture, the temples, the tombs, the colossal statues was designed to be overwhelming, a constant physical reminder of the king's divine power. When a common Egyptian saw the Karnak temple, they were seeing a home built by a god for his fellow gods. Huge public festivals, like the Opet Festival, were spectacles that served to renew and reaffirm the king's divine nature in front of everyone. Art even shows the pharaoh interacting with other gods, not as a servant, but as their equal. So, did the pharaohs themselves buy into it? All the evidence suggests they lived and breathed this reality. Their entire lives were a performance of divinity. But for the most extreme example of a king, not just believing in his godhood, but trying to radically redefine it, we have to look at the controversial figure of Akhenaten. Akhenaten inherited a system where the pharaoh was already a god, but for him, that wasn't enough. He saw the traditional pantheon of gods, led by the powerful state god Amun-Ra, as a distraction. So he launched a religious revolution. He declared there was only one true god. The Aten represented not as a person or animal, but as the physical disk of the sun, its rays ending in hands that offered life. And here's the crucial part. Akhenaten didn't just promote a new god. He completely rewrote the relationship between humanity and the divine. He declared that he and his queen, Nefertiti, were the only way to access the Aten. People were no longer supposed to worship all the old gods. Instead, they were to worship the divine royal family, who would in turn worship the Aten. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, moved the capital to a brand new city, and sent workers to chisel the names and images of the old gods off of temples all over Egypt. This wasn't just a political power grab to weaken the wealthy priests of Amun, though it was certainly that. It was an act of profound, radical belief. Akhenaten saw himself not just as a god, but as the exclusive pipeline to the only god. It was the ultimate expression of divine kingship, so extreme that after he died, his successors aggressively tore it all down, erased his memory, and labeled him the Heroded king. The institution of divine kingship in Egypt was so powerful that it absorbed anyone who sat on the throne. Even foreign conquerors, like the Persian king Darius I or Alexander the Great, had themselves carved into temples in the traditional style of a divine pharaoh to make their rule legitimate. The divinity was in the office itself. So for Egypt, the king's belief in his own divinity was inseparable from the functioning of the state and the cosmos. To question it would have been to question reality. But as we'll see, this absolute, institutionalized godhood was an exception in the ancient world. If we travel northeast into the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, we find a very different and much more human kind of king. Mesopotamia, the king is steward. Leaving the predictable valley of the Nile for the volatile floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers means entering a completely different way of thinking. Here in Mesopotamia, the land of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, the answer to our question is pretty much the opposite of what we found in Egypt. For most of its history, the people of Mesopotamia did not believe their kings were gods. And for the most part, the kings didn't seem to believe it either. The Mesopotamian worldview was that humanity was created to serve the gods. The gods were powerful, immortal, and often terrifyingly unpredictable. They controlled the world, and things like floods, droughts, and plagues were direct signs of their happiness or anger. In this cosmic pecking order, the king was not a god. He was the head servant. His role was that of a shepherd, chosen by the gods to lead his people, maintain the canals, build temples, and most importantly, perform the right rituals to keep the demanding gods satisfied. He was a divinely appointed agent and manager of the earthly estate for the city's true ruler, its patron god. Early inscriptions make this crystal clear. Kings would brag about their achievements, but always framed them as being done at the command of a god. Enlil, king of all the lands, ordered me to build this temple. They'd write. They got their authority from the divine, but they weren't divine themselves. This created a sense of humility, at least on paper. The king was powerful, but he was just as subject to the whims of the gods as the lowest farmer. Even the Assyrian kings, some of the most ruthless military commanders of the ancient world, consistently called themselves the mere servant of their national god, Ashur. All their victories belonged to him. But history is never that simple. There was one dramatic, shocking exception that broke this tradition, and in doing so, proved the rule. His name was Naram-Sin, grandson of the legendary Sargon the Great, who had forged the world's first empire. Naram-Sin ruled in the 23rd century BCE and was an incredibly successful military leader. After crushing a massive rebellion and expanding his empire, he did something no one had ever done before. He declared himself a god. He took the title God of Akkad and started writing his name with the cuneiform symbol, star-like sign called a dinger that was only ever used to identify deities. We can see this shocking claim on his magnificent victory stele. On it, Naram-Sin is shown as a giant, towering over his soldiers and enemies. Most importantly, he's wearing a horned helmet. In all Mesopotamian art before this point, the horned helmet was a symbol reserved exclusively for gods. By putting it on, Naram Sin was making a bold statement. I'm not just a shepherd, I'm a god. This was a radical break from tradition, and people noticed. While it might have served a political purpose by unifying a diverse empire, many saw it as an act of incredible arrogance. In later Mesopotamian literature, a story called The Curse of Agada directly blames the fall of the Akkadian Empire on Naram Sin's impiety. The tale goes that he disrespected the temple of the great god Enlil, and in response, the gods abandoned his city and ruined his empire. Whether that's what really happened is up for debate, but the fact that the story exists shows just how deeply the culture resisted the idea of a mortal king making himself a god. After Naram Sin, a few other kings, like Shulgi of Ur, would flirt with divinity, probably for similar political reasons. But the practice never really caught on. The Naram Sin experiment was seen as a cautionary tale, an overreach that practically begged for divine punishment. The Mesopotamian king soon went back to his traditional role as the humble servant of the gods. So why the huge difference from Egypt? It likely comes down to their different environments. The reliable, gentle flooding of the Nile may have inspired a view of the cosmos as stable and orderly, with the pharaoh as its guarantor. In contrast, the violent, unpredictable floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, plus the constant warfare between city-states, may have fostered a belief in a chaotic world run by powerful, moody gods. In a world like that, a human claiming to be a god wasn't just arrogant, it was absurd. Did Naram Sin truly believe he was a god? It's more likely he saw it as the ultimate form of political branding, a necessary move to justify his unprecedented imperial power. But for the civilization he ruled, it was a step too far. In Mesopotamia, kingship was sacred, but the king was always human. Before we head even further east to unravel China's unique concept of the mandate of heaven, think about this spectrum of belief. On one end, you have a literal god-king. On the other, a divinely chosen servant. If you're finding this look into the psychology of ancient power as interesting as I do, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We try to answer these deep questions about our shared past every week, and your support makes it possible. All right, on to the Emperor of China. China, the Son of Heaven. Our final stop is ancient China, where we find a third, totally distinct model of divine rule, and it's maybe the most philosophical of them all. The Chinese emperor was not a literal god like the pharaoh, nor was he just a servant of the gods like a Mesopotamian king. He held a unique title, Tianzi, the Son of Heaven. The title sounds impressive, and it was, but it didn't mean he was divine. The emperor wasn't the biological child of a god. Instead, his authority came from a concept that would shape Chinese history for over 3,000 years. The Tianming, or the Mandate of Heaven. To get the mandate, you first have to get Tian, or heaven. Tian wasn't a specific god like Horus or Marduk. It was a more abstract, impersonal, cosmic force, the source of all order, morality, and authority in the universe. It was believed that heaven would grant the right to rule to a just and competent person and his family. That divine backing was the mandate of heaven. The emperor, as the Son of Heaven, was the critical link between heaven and earth. His main duty was to maintain harmony in the world by ruling with wisdom, performing the right rituals, and being a moral example. If he ruled well, his dynasty would prosper, the land would be peaceful, and the people would thrive. But here's the revolutionary idea that sets the mandate of heaven apart. The mandate could be lost. Unlike the Egyptian pharaoh's inherent divinity, or the later European idea of the divine right of kings, the Chinese mandate was completely conditional. It was performance-based. If an emperor became corrupt, tyrannical, or just plain bad at his job, it was believed heaven would show its displeasure. This displeasure would take the form of natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, famines, and plagues. These disasters weren't seen as random acts of nature. They were read as cosmic signs that the ruling dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. And if the emperor had lost the mandate, the people had not only a right, but a moral duty to rebel and overthrow him. A successful rebellion was the ultimate proof that heaven had taken its favor from the old dynasty and given it to the new one. This idea created a brilliant and lasting framework for political legitimacy and change. It explained the rise and fall of dynasties, the dynastic cycle not as simple power grabs, but as the workings of a moral cosmos. It also meant that rulers were held accountable. Even a commoner could, in theory, rise up and become emperor if he could prove he had the moral fitness to rule by restoring order. In fact, the founders of two of China's most famous dynasties, the Han and the Ming, both came from peasant backgrounds. The classic case study is the overthrow of the Shang dynasty by the Zhou in the 11th century BCE. To justify their conquest, the Zhou developed and promoted the theory of the mandate of heaven. They claimed the last Shang kings had become cruel and corrupt, so heaven had commanded the virtuous rulers of the Zhou to take their place. It was a masterful piece of political philosophy that legitimized their rule and became the cornerstone of Chinese imperial ideology for millennia. So, did the Chinese emperor believe he was the son of heaven? Absolutely. But this belief wasn't about being divine. It was about having an immense and fragile responsibility. He was the key figure, holding the human and cosmic worlds in balance. His personal character had universal consequences. The mandate was both the source of his supreme authority and a constant, looming threat. It was a divine job that came with a terrifyingly public, cosmic performance review. So let's circle back to our main question. Did ancient kings actually believe they were gods? As we've seen across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, there's no single answer. The reality is a fascinating spectrum of belief, shaped by culture, environment, and philosophy. In Egypt, the answer is a firm yes. The pharaoh was a god incarnate, the linchpin of cosmic order. Their whole society was built on this fact. In Mesopotamia, the answer is generally no. The king was a divinely chosen servant, a steward for powerful and demanding gods. Kingship was sacred, but the king himself was mortal. The rare exceptions who claimed divinity, like Naram Sin, were remembered as cautionary tales about pride. And in China, we found a third way. The emperor was the son of heaven, not a god, but a divinely approved ruler whose right to rule depended entirely on his moral conduct. The mandate of heaven was a divine job that you could get fired from. These three models, the God King, the God Steward, and the God's accountable son, tell us something deep about the civilizations that created them. Egypt's stable environment might have encouraged a belief in an unchanging order embodied by the pharaoh. Mesopotamia's chaotic world may have demanded a king who could manage and appease fickle gods. And China's rich philosophical traditions produced a system where divine rule was tied directly to morality. The line between the divine and the political has always been a powerful way to legitimize power. Rulers throughout history have wrapped themselves in the language of destiny, divine will, or a sacred mission. We may not have rulers calling themselves gods anymore, but that desire to connect leadership with a higher purpose, to claim that your authority is more than just politics, is a theme that echoes from the ancient world right into our own. What does this tell you about the nature of power itself? And where do you see leaders today borrowing from these ancient playbooks, claiming a special mandate not from heaven or Horus, but from history, destiny, or the will of the people? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for exploring the nature of divine kingship with us. If you'd like to see more about how the ancient world was structured, check out our video on the social pyramids of these great civilizations. Don't forget to subscribe for more historical analysis, and we'll see you in the next one.